Do we need to radically rethink the current model for how the textile industry manages and phases out chemicals? Phil Patterson thinks we do. Welcome to Big Closet, Small Planet, made possible by the Laudes Foundation, the Rylander Foundation, and TENCEL. The podcast is produced in partnership with Ecotextile News. I'm Mike Schrager. Today we continue our segment called Make Your Case, where we invite experts and advocates and practitioners from the industry, or those who want to influence the industry, to argue a practical position. These positions are not the position of Big Closet, Small Planet or our sponsors, but they are interesting to keep the debate going. So today I have Phil Patterson, who is with us. And Phil, welcome. Come on and tell us your name and professional background and area of expertise.
Hi, Mike. My name is Phil Patterson. I have a degree in colour chemistry from a long time ago, and I'm a specialist in dyeing, printing and finishing with a specific focus on chemicals and sustainability. I worked in the dyeing industry for 9 years prior to joining Marks & Spencer, where I worked for 10 years as their dyeing, printing and finishing specialist. I've been working as an independent consultant for 13 years. I have clients who are retail brands, I have industry clients, and I work for industry bodies. I spend a lot of my time on the interface between industry and retail, and I am also chair of the ZDHC MRSL Council. More recently, I've been asked to be chair of the ZDHC Wastewater Council and also the chair of the Microfiber Consortium.
So, Phil, during the next few minutes, you're going to argue that we need to change the way we work with chemical management in our industry. Am I correct with that?
Absolutely.
So can you first remind our listeners how bad a problem chemicals are for people and nature and how much the textile industry contributes to the problem?
Well, over 100 million tonnes of textile fibres are produced annually, and the vast majority of those are dyed or printed. And this requires tens of millions of tonnes of chemicals which can and do find their way into the environment. Any chemical that's dumped into the environment can cause harm. It doesn't have to be toxic, carcinogenic or mutagenic, although these types of chemicals do cause problems for plants and animals in the environment. But a lot of problems are from what you would say were safe and nice chemicals that are dumped into the environment. Because when these get into, for example, a river, microbes will biodegrade them. They will breathe oxygen as they biodegrade the chemicals, and it robs the river or the watercourse of oxygen. And oxygen depletion is a huge problem that is far bigger, really, than the dumping of toxic, nasty chemicals into the water. We can argue whether the textile industry is the worst, the second worst, the third worst, where it comes in the pollution hierarchy. Nobody really knows the answer to that conclusively, but what we do know is it's a big contributor. And also another consideration is that when chemicals are manufactured or transported somewhere, there are greenhouse gas impacts from the manufacturing and transportation. And also, when chemicals are biodegraded, people think biodegradation is a great thing, but when chemicals are biodegraded, they release greenhouse gases. So there is both a pollution, a oxygen depletion, and a greenhouse gas issue related to textile chemicals.
How would you describe the current use model for textile chemicals, and what are the main issues that you think are associated with this model?
Well, the textile industry itself is centuries old, and the modern textile industry is around at about 150 years old, and that's when synthetic dyes were manufactured and we got lift off of a big industry. Originally, it was what I would describe as a buy, use, dump model, and people would buy chemicals, use them for their own purposes, and then dump the chemicals in the environment. And at that point, about a century ago, up until probably 30, 40 years ago, there was extensive use of chemicals that were very harmful to workers and consumers, and there were horrendous levels of pollution via discharge of untreated wastewater or effluent. And legislation started to take action and brands started to take action. And over the past 20, 30 years, there's been a significant reduction in the number of harmful chemicals in widespread use. And we've seen significant improvements in wastewater treatment prior to discharge. However, whilst there's quite a lot of focus on which chemicals are used, there's very little focus on how much is used. So there's still vast quantities of chemicals being used. The wastewater treatment has been improving across the board, but there's still pockets of really poor practice. And wastewater treatment is seen as a good thing. And I've always talked about wastewater treatment as a good thing. But actually, it's only partial remediation of those chemicals. And it's a variant of the by-use dump model. So the model itself is based on using the chemical and then dumping it. And we've improved that. We've improved the chemicals that are used, and we've improved remediation before it is dumped. But it's still the same basic model.
So then how would you summarize what we should be aiming to do? Because that's how it is. What are you arguing that we need to do?
Fundamentally, what we should be aiming to do is use lower net volumes of chemicals and reduce the amounts that are dumped into the environment, whether that is unremediated or partially remediated. If we achieve this, we will also reduce the impact on climate change because there will be less chemicals manufactured and less transported. And really, we should be asking ourselves, is it okay to use chemicals for our own financial gain and then dump them in the environment for society to share the negative environmental consequences? And I think we should be agreeing the answer to that question is no.
So you've written a report, Phil, arguing that the need for a more circular model in chemical management, right? Circularity in chemical management to replace what you've just described as this by-use dump model. Can you further explain what this concept is and how you think it will help reduce the net chemical use and the amount of chemicals that you say now are dumped into the environment?
Yeah, chemical circularity is simply recovery and reuse of chemicals. Now, currently, each individual processor in the textile manufacturing chain uses chemicals and then either passes them down the chain on a product. So, for example, a spinner will use spinning oils and pass them down the chain to a knitter or a weaver. A weaver will use weaving size and pass those down the chain to a dyer or a printer. And a dyer and printer typically receives a product that is covered in chemicals that they have to use another set of chemicals to remove the chemicals that are on the product that they receive. And then they have to use another set of chemicals to apply the chemicals they want to apply, typically dyes and finishes. And at the end of that process, we have this product with dyes and finishes on there, and then we have this chemical soup of all the chemicals that have been used in all processes throughout the textile manufacturing process in the wastewater treatment plant. Now, if every individual chemical user took responsibility to send a clean, chemical-free product down the chain, we would see spinners removing spinning oil before passing the yarns onto the knitters and weavers. We would see weavers removing weaving size so that dyers and printers didn't have to do the job for them. And if you actually look at that, something like a weaver, if the weaver removed the weaving size, what would they do with it? Would they throw it away? Would they build an effluent treatment plant to remediate it before putting it into the environment? Or would they reuse it? And I hope that would be a no-brainer and they would start to reusing it. And it would mean that far fewer chemicals were needed in downstream processing by the dyers and printers because they'd have far fewer chemicals to remove. Now, in the wet processing, in the dyeing and printing area, it's a little more complex because there are chemical reactions. It's not just a case of starting with chemical A and chemical B and having them recycled at the end. there will be some reactions that makes it a bit more complex, but there are opportunities for recovery and reuse of chemicals in wet processing.
So, is this a sort of blue sky, pie in the sky, maybe academic concept that you're describing that you want to happen? Or do you think this is actually something we can apply in practice? This is something we can begin to implement as soon as possible?
The key thing here is to make the chemical user responsible for the chemicals they use. Now, I've referred to this in the report as the CURE model, the chemical user responsibility model. And once this concept is understood, we can break down a manufacturing chain into a series of steps, with each step being relatively simple and being a relatively simple chemical use story that's manageable, thus avoiding the inevitability of this complex chemical soup that we have. So once that is understood, once that key concept of making the user responsible for the chemicals they use, once that clicks, it becomes quite simple and it doesn't become academic. That's the only academic bit of it. There are already some examples. There are some examples of recycling of weaving size. There is some use of alkali in mercerization, which is a pre-treatment for cotton. For some concepts that will require, there will be some study required, but not what I'd call blue sky. It doesn't really need to be overly complex. So, for example, we could potentially remove the natural substances from cotton and use them for something good. At the moment, they're just problematic. But if we look at lanolin and wool as an example, lanolin is removed from wool and used as a co-product with the wool. Can that be the same with cotton? Now, we might need to use some solvents to do this. These solvents can be recoverable, recycling, and we might have an opportunity, by looking at it in this way, of reducing the chemical loading in wastewater by as much as 60%. Now, people think of cotton as lovely and natural. It's a massive contributor to pollution via the use of safe chemicals used in processing and the natural chemicals that are present on it. So this is something that would require research to look at, can we remove the natural impurities on cotton at source? But it's not real detailed science. This is really fairly basic stuff that we should be able to do fairly quickly. Now, in other areas, we will need to look at engineering solutions. So at the moment, all the engineering is based on the buy, use, dump model, or the buy, use, partially remediate, dump model. So we will need some engineering solutions, but this is a few tanks and pipes and pumps and willpower. We don't need towering intellect.
Oh, that's good to know. So how, Phil, do you see this going from idea to practice? How does it get introduced and rolled out at the scale we need? Is this based on the goodwill and good sense of the industry, or do we need financial incentives, brand incentives, regulation? Tell us.
Well, the good news is ZDHC has been sufficiently impressed by the pragmatism of the report to take the concept of chemical circularity into their work programme, and that's very positive. They've got a huge influence over the industry and a good track record of driving change. Now, generally, I'm a big fan of looking at things in terms of carrots and sticks, so incentives and punishment. And whilst I'm very much in favour of sticks, I think we're in carrot territory at present for chemical circularity. So promotion of good practice via an approved scheme or logo may be the way to go. So, for example, we could have field scoured cotton, we could have weaver scoured fabric, we could have caustic recovered mercerization, and promote those via a logo in stores, via retail brands. We can then move on to restrictions on bad practice, where good practice is a no-brainer. So, for example, mercerization uses a huge amount of alkali, and if that goes into the wastewater treatment plant, you need a huge amount of acid to neutralize it to make that wastewater safe to put out into the environment. So ideally, you'll be saying that is a process where chemical circularity should apply. I think introducing legislation to mandate recovery and reuse of, for example, dye bath additives like antioxidants and lubricants by 2022 is a little ambitious and not really practical. But the older I get, the more I see consumption growing, I think we need some radical solutions. And with that in mind, I would support a rollout of a process called Zero Liquid Discharge. And this is where no effluent discharge is allowed. So no wastewater is allowed to leave the premises of wet processors. And this single change would catalyse a huge wave of innovation, implementation of new business models, in my opinion. So if you were not permitted as an industry to release any wastewater into the environment, people would then start looking at how do we minimise the amounts of chemicals in that effluent. So that is something where that would need governments, it would need brands to work together. But I think possibly a radical change like that would be better than a step-by-step incentivisation via logos. But the two could work hand in hand.
So chemical circularity sounds really interesting. Sounds like it has a lot of potential. But I'm guessing you need engagement from the chemical industry to make it happen. I'm not sure. So how do you sell in this concept of selling lower volumes, which it seems to be the implication, to a sector that is predisposed to sell higher volumes, Phil?
Well, the genesis of this report, commissioned by the Laudes Foundation, was looking at chemical leasing. And this is a concept where companies sell the function of a chemical rather than the volume of a chemical. It's a slightly abstract concept, but the focus is on the function of the chemical. And the better chemical industry have actually been doing this for quite a long time. They've been developing better chemicals that are more effective at lower concentrations. So they have got this mindset anyway to some extent. So they have been producing and selling chemicals that are more effective, that are used in lower volumes. But there is an unavoidable element of asking the turkeys to vote for Christmas. Because if you're looking at an industry, the chemical industry, that makes its money by selling chemicals, to say that we want to vastly reduce that is not something that's very appealing for them. And there may be an element of, if chemical circularity becomes mainstream, just well, that's life. A little bit like when digital photography ruined the silver halide business with normal 35mm films. But they may have the opportunity to adapt to becoming a chemical service or a chemical management company that sell, recover, and repurpose chemicals for reuse. And they may do the job for the cotton farmers, the spinners, the weavers, etc. And they may even be able to recover useful chemicals out of the chemical soups that emerge from wet processors. So rather than looking at refineries and crude oil for their raw materials, maybe there's some way of looking at the soups that emerge from the chemical industry. But yes, we'll need to get them engaged, and it will be a massive challenge. Those that I've spoken to, actually, the technical guys in those companies relish the challenge. They think it is something that, you know, they understand the way the world is going and the environmental challenges, and they would look at this as a massive challenge, but they'd also have to see it as a potential problem.
You proposed a whole new way of thinking about chemical management. Are there any words of caution as you think through what the implications of this could be? Maybe you want to identify where it could go wrong.
The concept is relatively simple. The chemical user responsibility concept is quite simple, and there will be some easy wins, but some areas that are more complex. So we should walk before we start to run. We should also avoid recycling for recycling's sake. Now, at the moment, you get the impression that some people will put a sandwich wrapper on a private plane and fly it from New York to Taipei in order to get a recycled tag. And we don't want to advocate things that use more energy, water, and chemicals for the recycling process than are saved merely to get a tag. So that's one thing we want to make sure is implemented. It's pragmatic. It's not just something where people are actively seeking tags rather than doing the right thing. The other thing as well is that I mentioned at the start that the chemical industry and the textile industry has improved dramatically over the past 30 or 40 years with respect to the types of chemicals that are used. But many of those chemicals are actually have been developed with a buy, use, dump model in mind. That they are safer chemicals that are okay to dump in the environment, sort of. And what we might need to do is look at more harmful chemicals, potentially, that are easier to recycle. And that will need a change of emphasis as well. So when we start looking at what is a good chemical, maybe recyclability starts to go up that priority list. So there will be some challenges there with the way that chemicals are viewed, because we need to have an adult conversation about risk and about hazard. And the conversation has been dominated by hazard for the past few decades. And actually, we need to start looking at exposure as well. And some harmful chemicals that are used safely may be a big part of the solution here. And that brings me on to exposure control as well. The exposure control for workers in wet processing is pretty poor, actually. And in the textile industry in general, the levels of exposure to chemicals historically have been really far too high. And we need to address that. In the upstream chemical industry, it's not perfect, but they tend to be much tighter controls. They're used to handling harmful chemicals in a safe way. In order that we roll this out in the future, we may need to introduce much tighter exposure control in wet processing. So we may need to see dyers and printers operating with the same levels of engineering control that we see maybe in dye manufacturing or something like that. So that is something where we will need to have some significant engineering changes in the current wet processing industry for this to happen.
So, Phil, you have taken the last few minutes to make your case. Uh, any final words that you want to leave the audience with?
Just really to say that the model that we've all been using for the last few centuries, I've been working in the industry for 30 years and I've just seen this as normal. The buy, use, dump model is a flawed model. And we do need to work towards a more circular model with less deliberate use, more reuse, and lower net discharge to the environment. Zero net usage is impossible, and I think setting zero net usage it will just set us down the track of procrastination for years on end. The main thing is that it isn't okay to use chemicals to privatise the profits and socialise the damage. You know, we can't do that as an industry. We're all global citizens, and we've got to be more responsible. In doing the work for the Laudes report on chemical circularity, I've had to appraise my own relationship with chemicals and what I've deemed to be good and what I've deemed to be bad. And I've actually realised that my definition of good was actually less bad. Good requires new models, it requires new ways of working. and probably or possibly a commitment to no deliberate discharges of chemicals from the textile industry. We need to be brave, and we need to accept that what we've been doing for the past few centuries actually isn't very good.
So, everyone, Phil Patterson has made his case. What do you all think? It is a complex and interesting proposal. Reach out to us at sustainablefashionacademy.org. Let us know what you think. I'm sure Phil will be happy to receive your views on this, won't you, Phil?
Absolutely, yes.
And the opinion, of course, argued today by Phil is not the official stance of Big Closet Small Planet or of our partners and sponsors, but we are so excited to have people like Phil come on to make their case. And with that, I want to thank you, Phil, for being clear about what the proposal is, and hopefully we will hear back and see how this proceeds in the industry. Thanks so much.
Thank you.